Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we are going to be taking a jump over to the lighter side of things. And I don't mean in terms of flavor or even necessarily in terms of ABV, but I'm talking in terms of color. So today we're going to be taking a journey through a couple of pale beers, and we've got one lager and one ale. So two nice pale ends of the two broad-based beer categories spectrum. So the very first beer we're going to be starting with, this is the first beer I've ever had from this brewer. It's Acre Brewing's Natural Liberty. This is a pale lager that clocks in at 5.4% ABV, and they are based in Indianapolis, Indiana. For number two, you may already be able to tell from the bottle, we've done a few of their beers. This is a Friem. This is their extra pale ale, which is indeed an extra pale ale. So they tend to name their beers what they are. Some have names, but this one, just extra pale ale. 6.5% on this one, and they are based in Hood River, Oregon. So I kind of tiered these up where I'm starting with what I think is going to be the least intense to the most intense, and it's not just based on ABV. Typically, a pale lager is going to be a bit lighter in terms of flavor and intensity than a pale ale. Obviously, these do tend to have more hoppy characteristics, but we'll get into that when we get to the individual beers. But it's been a while since I've kind of jumped in on the lighter side of things, so I decided to switch it up. I do enjoy these very much. So without further ado, we're going to jump right in, starting with Acre Brewing's Natural Liberty, the pale lager of the bunch that clocks in at 5.4% ABV. Okay, so jumping right into the first beer of today's pale beer review, we have got Acre Brewing's Natural Liberty. This is the pale lager we're reviewing today, 5.4% ABV on this one. They are based in Indianapolis, Indiana. So this is the first beer I've ever had from this brewer. I always absolutely love trying new beers from new brewers I've never tried. So this is always going to be fun. And yes, indeed, I did get both beers from Tavour for today's review. So starting off in terms of label art, it's got Statue of Liberty proudly on the front, so Natural Liberty, good name of the beer, and they do specify it's an American pale lager, lest there was any doubt. So one other thing on here, they do give you some more details about what to expect. You don't see this on all beers, but since they put the information down, I'll tell you. I'm just going to read right off the can. Aggressively citra hopped with plenty of bold citrus hop notes and a light Pilsner malt body. So that right there alone gets me pretty excited. And then on the back, opposite side, they do actually tell you the anticipated IBUs, 35 IBUs. Well, not anticipated. That is the IBUs. It's just kind of where you can gauge. IBUs really, it's more of a specific, it's a specific measurement of something actual tangible that's scientific. But the perception, we've talked about this, is different from person to person. Something with a very low IBU could taste extremely bitter, just depending on the contrast and type of style from person to person. And the converse is also true. Something with very, very high IBUs may not necessarily taste bitter at all. It really is all about perception. So that's just the actual, IBU, what it is from a scientific perspective, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to taste very bitter or not very bitter based on that number. So without further ado, let's get this cracked, poured right into the glass. We're using our nice all-purpose Sam Adams glass today, which works well for all beer styles. All right. Getting that one poured right in the glass. This is indeed a beautiful, beautiful light lager. Puts me in mind of a Pilsner right away in terms of how it's forming its head and its color profile. So very nice looking beer. Let's cut that little nose scratch. Very nice looking beer indeed. All right, visually, yeah, that really is. That's a very nice, true straw pale yellow color. Very typical for pretty much all lagers and indeed a Pilsner, which it reminds me of with this nice, thick, creamy, frothy head you could see it formed. It did a great job. Let's give it a sniff. I'll tell you. Yeah, there are elements of this that definitely put me in mind of a Pilsner as well in terms of aroma, and it's really kind of the intensity, the hops that are coming off. Typically, lagers aren't going to be as aggressive with the hops as, say, ales or pale ales or India pale ales, but this does have a very nice and pronounced hop aroma to it. and there is some nice orange undertones to it. It does have citra hops, that's very common, and it smells quite nice. Now, another thing I can tell you about this is that malt bill. Also, much like a Pilsner, it's got a very distinct. You can smell the hops and you can smell the malts. I don't want to say this smells identical to a typical Pilsner malt bill, but it does have elements that remind me. It smells like it might be a little biscuity. You can kind of smell that. So I'm expecting kind of some baked good profiles here. There's not really any of that honey sweetness you get from time to time on the aroma on the pale lager here, which you do often get with Pilsners. Not all of them, but you do sometimes. So it does share some common elements. But without further ado, looks great. Let's jump right in, give it a sip. Oh, that's very nice. Wow. Wow. That's very nice indeed. Okay, so 35 IBUs it may be. And this really comes back to what I was talking about, where IBUs don't necessarily mean anything in terms of perception. Something with relatively low or relatively high could taste far more bitter or far less bitter. This 35 IBUs for this style, I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting that big of a bitter bite. I know what they said, and I know the hop they said they used, and I know what I smelled, but I really didn't anticipate it having this big of a bite. This has a very pronounced hop bite and very pronounced bitter forward edge to it. If you're a hophead, this one's going to please you greatly. I always like new beers anyway, but I honestly did not expect this to be this hop forward. That's very, very nice. Yeah, Citra, a very good choice. And they did say specifically it was aggressively hopped. I believe it. It tastes like it. It absolutely tastes like it. It's fantastic. Now, in terms of the malt bill, this does not really remind me whatsoever of a Pilsner malt bill. And while I did smell kind of some biscuity, kind of baked good undertones, I'll be honest, the intensity of the hop is so great that really the hop dominance is the far, far most prevalent flavor that's coming through in this beer, which as an admitted hophead, that's not a problem for me. But I'm definitely going to have to go back in for another dive and really think on it to see what I'm getting out of this malt bill. There's not really any classic Pilsner crispness or dryness to the end of it, so it stays nice and wet and round to the end. And in terms of the finish, this one's so hop dominant for what it is, and frankly, compared to the other elements of the beer, it's really sticking out, and it does have a much longer finish to it than I was anticipating. It really is just that pungent biting bitter from the citra hops I'm getting in the back. I'm going to go in for one more sip, body and mouthfeel, think on this flavor profile a bit more. The body on this one is medium light. It's not super heavy at all. It's maybe a little lighter than I'd anticipate for 5.4% ABV, but it's not much lighter than I anticipated. In terms of mouthfeel, this actually has quite a bit more resistance than I anticipated for the style and for the ABV. So it's a little dichotomous. It's got a little lighter body and a little more viscous mouthfeel. So they're not really working hand in hand in terms of balancing each other out like being on even pair. But since the body's a little lighter and there's a little more resistance to the mouthfeel, it does help kind of counterbalance it out. So it's quite nice. It's very enjoyable to feel on the palate. In terms of this malt bill, there is a little bit of that classic Pilsner-like baked good quality to it. But this one for me is a lot more cracker-like than it is biscuity. So there are baked good elements, but it's more roasty to the edge. And I don't know if that's just because how the flavors are pairing with that astringent bitter side, that it's tasting more like a more charred, like, you know, you take a biscuit, and I mean an American biscuit, like a buttermilk biscuit, like you would get in the South. That's a completely different flavor profile and type of browning for the crust you would get on a biscuit than, say, what you would get from a cracker. Think of, you know, just like a nice wheat cracker, something like that. It's much more intense. It's that richer, more roasty edge to the product than that lighter, fluffier side you get with the biscuit. So yes, it does have these elements, but it's a lot more on the roasty side, which frankly is pairing very, very well with this very hop-forward, aggressive nature to it. It's very, very nice beer. I'm going to jump in for one more sip and final thoughts here. Big, big, big citron notes right up front. Just this big citrusy bite, which you do get from it. And it's just bitters. It's just delicious bitters. And it's easily 85 to 90% of that flavor profile is the hops that they put in this. And then it's maybe 15 to 10% of kind of the malt bill that's coming through. That's really coming through on the back end. And like I said, it does have a very long finish. The hops are really, really pushing it out for the style, which is nice. You get a little more for your money out of each sip. I personally enjoy it. Frankly, I think this is an absolutely delicious pale lager. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get to the second beer of today's review. That is Friem's Extra Pale Ale. The pale ale of the bunch, of course, and that one clocks in at 6.5% ABV. Okay, now jumping into the second beer of today's pale beer review. We've got Friem's Extra Pale Ale. It is an extra pale ale. So this one's 6.5% ABV. They're based in Hood River, Oregon. We've done quite a few beers from them now, and all of them have been really, really good. They are quickly climbing up my personal list of brewers that if I see something new, I'm going to grab it. I've just really appreciated what they've done with their beers. So 6.5 on an extra pale ale. Extra pale ales tend to be kind of in that same family, obviously, as all pale ales are, but they do tend to be much higher hop than what maybe you would anticipate. So on the heels of that very hoppy pale lager, I am indeed very curious to see how these compare. So I'm going to get this cracked. And as is typical with Friem, these have very, very clean designs. It looks cool. It's a nice, clean black label with gold lettering, and it's all the way around. And on this one, they do kind of tell you about what kind of accents and stuff that you may experience in the beer. Now, I'm not going to read that. I did see it on there, but I don't want to have preconceived notions. But for me, really the beer is its own experience, and everybody experiences it differently. So let's just get this poured right in the glass here. Yep, that is indeed extra pale. Looks roughly the same color as that first beer, so can't really tell them apart. Pale ale, pale lager, it's nice and pale. This one's also forming a nice head. I had to stop to give it a little room to build there. Yeah, absolutely lovely. Actually, if anything, this is just a little bit darker than the first one, but I would still call this for sure a pale ale. No question about it. It is quite pale for an ale. There's a slight orange hint, orange tint to it, but it is mostly a nice pale yellow. Looks very, very nice. Formed another just lush, creamy head. Both of these beers, as I expected for their styles, form a nice head, and indeed they did. Let's get down for a proper sniff here. Oh, that's very nice. Yeah, it smells quite nice. You can definitely smell the hops, and indeed there's a lot of fruit characteristics coming through on the nose. I'm getting a mix of citrus and actually melons and berries. So it's kind of got a mix of, say, cantaloupe, honeydew. I was kind of picking up some citrus. It smelled more combination of like orange and lemon. And there's some berries, kind of some underlying blueberry and strawberry aromas as well. It smells quite nice. It's a very nice looking beer, and it smells quite nice. One more sniff. Yeah. And there's this underlying distinct, slightly floral and slightly earthy mix of hops that are coming through on the aroma. So mixed with all these fresh, ripe fruit and this nice blend of a couple different categorical hop aromas from how I break them down. Yeah, smells quite nice. I'm looking forward to jumping into this one. That head is holding very thick, very strong and true, so that's nearly an inch deep, but I'm just going to have to make a mess in my mustache here, and we're going to dive right in. Yeah, that's very nice. That's very nice. Very fruity. The hops really are imparting a lot of fruit character into this beer. And it's interesting. Based on the aroma alone, it doesn't taste like what I expected. I'm actually getting a really thick caramel and toffee-like malt bill characteristic that's coming through. And up front, this is noticeably not as astringently bitter as the pale lager was. So it's hoppy, but it's got a lot more in common with, say, not a lot of extracted into the boil alphas and hop characteristics versus more of like a dry hopping characteristic that's adding all these interesting and wonderful aromas to the beer. So it's very aromatic. And a lot of that is being translated into the flavor. There's for sure very fruit flavored notes in here. There's a little bit of citrus, though even though that did come through quite clearly on the aroma, it's not as dominant in the flavor profile. It's got a much more berry and melon. Like I picked up cantaloupe, honeydew, for sure strawberry, blueberry. In the flavor profile, a lot of that is translating. I'm having a hard time picking out exactly what berries I think flavor-wise are coming in through with the melon. But there's also like a subtle, almost maybe pineapple. There's a little tropical fruit note side to it as well, like pineapple and maybe passion fruit mixed with honeydew and cantaloupe and some berries. So I'm definitely going to have to jump in for a second sip here, but it's very, very nice. And that caramelly toffee-like malt bill, I didn't anticipate. And it actually reminds me of a couple different beers I've had where there's a slight suggestion on the front when you're first tasting that malt bill. Aside from caramel and toffee, it's almost got like some diacetyls coming through. There's like this buttered popcorn like quality to it. And it literally does taste like that. I'm not just saying that, it tastes like it. I don't know if you've ever experienced a beer like that, but there's different esters that come off in beers during the brewing process. And they can come out in ales as well as lagers. But this one is kind of doing that. It makes for a very interesting and unique beer drinking experience. It's quite nice. I'm going to jump in for another sip, think on body and mouthfeel, and see if I can pick apart this flavor profile a bit more. Body on this is a solid medium. It's a big, robust medium. Mouthfeel has a really nice resistance to it. It perfectly matches the body. And really, the body and the mouthfeel, I'd say they're very much more than I would anticipate. 6.5, it's not a low ABV, but it's not super high either. I'm impressed by it. It's got real presence. Yeah, that malt bill is really doing its trick. Bitters really come on the back end. It's not astringently bitter, but they do make their appearance on the back end. But really what you're getting up front is big, bright, rich fruit mixed with this caramelly and toffee-like malt bill that does have like this underlying kind of buttered popcorn quality to it. It's quite nice. It's quite nice. It's very enjoyable. In terms of the berries I'm getting, it does taste quite a bit like blueberry. There is a little suggestion of strawberry. It's not, I don't really taste raspberry. I don't taste blackberry, no boysenberry. It's really kind of a combination of blueberry and strawberry mixing with pineapple and passion fruit and cantaloupe and honeydew. There's all of these interesting, it's a very nice, all of those really work together. Like I don't know if a brewer's ever put that exact fruit bill together and put into a beer, but they definitely work. They definitely work, and the flavors taste very balanced. Obviously, they didn't brew with these fruit in this beer. This is all just byproducts of the hops that they used in the brewing process, but it tastes very, very nice. Very, very enjoyable beer. In terms of finish, this one's not super long. It doesn't have a lot of lingering bitters that really help push it out. It's very much on the average end of the spectrum, maybe high end of average, but it's not what I would call a very long finish. And this, just as with the first beer, it's not dry, it doesn't feel truncated. It's nice and wet and round to the end. Very, very nice beer. Now, in terms of what I'm getting out of this malt bill and like the hop characteristics that are coming through, it's very, very well balanced. It's you get a good balance of that malt bill that comes in and then all of the hop additive kind of craziness that's happening in here. And it's very well balanced. So you're really getting almost dead even 50-50 equal parts hop characteristics and malt characteristics, which is really nice. In an extra pale ale, that's kind of what I want. I want to taste that malt bill, taste everything that went into it, and I also want to taste all the hop characteristics that come to the table. They did a very, very good job with this one. I'm going to jump in one more sip for final thoughts here. It's very, very good. Very, very good. My big takeaway here on third sip, everything that I picked out is still coming through. It gets a little more clearer with each successive sip because I've got all these residual flavors lingering and I'm just adding on top of it, adding on top of it. So it does intensify. The bitters do intensify a little bit as well, but it's not what I would term a very particularly bitter beer at all. The big takeaway for me here is wonderful balance, very unique flavor characteristics, and very complex. This is indeed a very complex, easily one of the most complex, if not the most complex, extra pale ale I've ever had. There's a lot of flavors and interplays happening here, and it's positively enjoyable. I'm going to take my time, sip on this one, count my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both of these beers, we're going to get them ranked. Starting with Black Acre Brewing's Natural Liberty, this was the pale lager of the bunch, 5.4% ABV on this one. They're based in Indianapolis, Indiana. Starting with the aroma. The aroma, I was really kind of taken aback. I did not expect it to be that forward and bold, even though they said they did aggressively hop with Citra hops, but that was very, very evident. It smelled very strongly of hops and very citrus specifically with those classic Citra notes. Citrus notes underneath it, and indeed you could still smell the malt bill. Overall, well above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. For the taste, really, I would be hard-pressed to think of a pale lager I've liked as well. And for me personally, it really did come down to how aggressively it was hopped. This was far hoppier than even many of your average pale ales and some IPAs. It was very, very aggressive with the hops, and I think it kind of sets itself apart as this pale lager that's just super, super hoppy. Get those with the ales, but not as often with the lagers. It was really a nice treat and a nice direction to go with the style. I appreciated it. I gave it a perfect 10 out of 10. For the body on this beer was very much just average for the style in the ABV range. I didn't expect it would be that huge. 5.4, maybe I expected it to be a bit bigger than what it was, but very much average, right in the middle of the range. It gets a 5 out of 10. For the mouthfeel. Mouthfeel was actually quite a bit more resistant than I anticipated, especially once I was thinking on the breadth of the body. But it really did have quite a lot of resistance, and it was very ale-like in that respect, and really, really enjoyed it. I gave that a perfect 10 out of 10. For the finish on this was very long, far longer than your average pale lager or most lagers in general, really, and it really did all come down to the hops. They used a big high alpha acid hop, Citra, and they aggressively hopped with it, and it did pay dividends. Very long finish, gets a 9 out of 10. Head and retention, this one did just a tremendous job. As I was pouring it, I was saying, wow, this really is pouring very much like a classic Pilsner head, and it did. It was really creamy, rich, foamy, thick, dense, and it lasted the whole time. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the appearance, this was exactly as advertised. The pale lager looked exactly as I expected. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was exceptional. Really, overall, I appreciated it. Tons of hop presence, tons of hop bitters, tons of hop nuances, and the malt bill was still in there as well. Really, that was the only criticism. As much of a hop head as I am, I would have liked a little more of that lager malt bill to come through because it was clear they used a very good one. But I only docked 1 point here. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the feeling and the intangible, subjectively, I absolutely loved it. This was one of the most enjoyable pale lagers I've ever had. I give it a 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, really this beer did very, very well across most categories. For me, really, if the body had had just a little bit more breadth and a couple other points in a couple categories, it probably would have gotten top marks. But I only docked 1 here. It gets a 9 out of 10, which brings the total score on Black Acre Brewing's Natural Liberty to a 90 out of 100. This is well above average. If you're a fan of hoppy beers and you've never had a very hoppy pale lager, this is one to seek. It really was a treat. Moving on to beer number 2, the Venerable P. Friem. This was their Extra Pale Ale and Extra Pale Ale. 6.5% ABV on this one. They're based in Hood River, Oregon. For the aroma on this beer was nice. It did smell very good. It did smell very, very interesting with a very kind of complex aroma to it. Tons of different fruit and fruit variety was coming up in the nose as well as the malt bill, but it wasn't super pungent. Just high end of average. It gets a 6 here. For the taste, I absolutely loved it. Now, that being said, for me, really what got the score for the taste was just how delicious and complex it was. Ribbons of caramel, toffee, all sorts of different berries and melons and various other fruit. And it really was just super complex, far more complex than your average extra pale ale. But that being said, in this specific style, I would have liked a little more aggressive hopping. I would have liked a little more hop bitters to come through in this beer for top marks. I only docked one though. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the body, the breadth of the body on this beer was far larger than anticipated, certainly for the style and most definitely for the ABV. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the mouthfeel, similar story. It had a lot of resistance, a lot of viscosity to it, much more so than I anticipated for both the style and the ABV. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10 here as well. For the finish, at first I was surprised by it not being any longer than it was, but then as I thought on it, you know, there's not really all this aggressive bittering, those lingering hop bitters, which normally are what are going to push out the length of the finish on a beer style like this. It was present, there were some bitters, but it was not as aggressively hopped as your typical extra pale ale. And really, it was just high end of average here. It gets a 6 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one was just like the first. Just lush and thick, held around the whole time. Gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the appearance on this beer was nice. But it was a little bit more caramel in color than I anticipated, which really just comes down to quantity and the depth of the roasting on the barley. But it was a little bit of a deviation from the norm. Only docked 1 point there, though. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was exceptional. While personally the hop head side of me would have loved more bitters, the fact that I could taste all of the hop characteristics and that malt bill, and it was just so bloody good and complex and really was balanced beautifully to let everything come out. I couldn't dock any points here. It gets a 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. Now this is where I can dock some points because this is subjective. Overall, I absolutely loved the beer. I was just craving more hops, but frankly, it was so enjoyable, so complex for the style, I only docked 1. It gets a 9 out of 10. Which, speaking of the style, as an example of the style, I think this is a very, very interesting beer. This is far more complex than your average EPA, and it may not necessarily be as hoppy, but for me, I still really enjoyed what it brought to the table. It was just ribbons of flavor. Honestly, I've had barley wines that weren't as complex as this, and that is super high praise. Well done, it gets a 9 out of 10, which brings the total score on Friem's Extra Pale Ale to an 88 out of 100. So yet again, another well above average offering. We're only looking at a 2-point spread here, a 90 and an 88. Both nice pale versions of various beer subcategories here. The lager and the ale, they were both excellent and distinctly different. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you just click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.